Well, COVID-19 has shown the importance of data sharing, whether this is to support the health response, vaccine delivery, or to plan and deliver programs targeting the social and economic impact of the pandemic on various groups. With more information available, better decisions can be made, but in doing this, there's also a balance that needs to be achieved to ensure that data sharing does not impact rights to privacy. Joining me in a conversation today are experts in data sharing and the challenges that come with this. And we will discuss whether data sharing in development can be achieved without breaching privacy and human rights. I'm joined by Shaida Badiee, co-founder and managing director of Open Data Watch, Agnieszka Rawa, the managing director of Data Collaboratives for Local Impact, a program within the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and Professor Joe Cannataci, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to privacy, as well as the head of the Department of Information Policy and Governance within the Faculty of Media and Knowledge Sciences at the University of Malta. Thank you for joining me. So let's jump into this conversation. Now, Shaida, it's actually timely that we're having this discussion because Open Data Watch has recently released an executive summary from your latest Open Data Inventory that is going to be released in full in February. And initial data is showing that open data is on the rise with significant improvements in the likes of Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. So can you start us off by telling us what's happened to improve openness and sharing of data, and what are the barriers that still exist?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for the invitation to be here on such a timely and important topic. So the data sector that we're talking about is official statistics, which is produced by governments and national statistical offices, such as for applications such as monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, to have an efficient and effective data sharing ecosystem in this sector, we really need a number of elements to come together. We call this the data value chain, which describes the evolution of data from collection to analysis, dissemination, and of course, important part, sharing of data, and the final impact of data on decision-making. Depending on the circumstances in countries, there are barriers at various levels. One important barrier that we should really keep in mind is that some countries just do not have the resources to run regular, expensive data surveys or census or building civil registration, vital statistics. So capacity and financial resources is a big barrier for many of the countries. Now, the other barrier, which is even when you have the data, is many countries or many organizations have not been able to make that data accessible and looking at it from the user perspective, useful and easy to download and clear in terms of use and legally and technically available. So that's what my group does. And every year or so, we go back to looking at the data sets in different countries. We look at something like 60 sets of indicators and look at it both from the coverage of data, but also of the openness of data in 187 countries. And we just released that new round of what we call Open Data Inventory. And the analysis shows that, as you said, good news, and we really need good news these days, don't we? That open official statistics on the rise. And in fact, this year, we have seen more improvements than we have seen in all the previous four rounds that we have done. The other good news is that the top performing countries, the 30 top performing countries, although many high income countries are there, but they're diversifying. And we see other countries such as Palestine, such as United Arab Emirates joining the top 30 and even top 10. For example, Mongolia, who's really working hard on open data, has just made it to the top 10 in the Open Data Inventory Index. Now, as you said, the Caribbean countries and Caribbean, Pacific Islands, and Africa, we've seen the most significant improvements in open data. But of course, low-income countries, when you look at the areas where the weaknesses are, where I always say the devil is in the details, so you have to really go and look at the details of data, you will see the areas that they need more help on is the area where they need to have more financial resources, improving data sets, improving websites, making sure that data is downloadable. But then one other thing that I just wanted to mention is that what we're seeing is some, in measuring this kind of openness and availability of data, that some sectors are doing better and some sectors are doing worse than others. For example, one area which we focus on is gender data. And we see that the through an index that we have designed called Open Gender Data Index as part of ODIN. And we see that gender is actually falling behind other sectors. So that's an area where we need much more emphasis. Many countries have the data, let's say time use surveys or other surveys, but they just haven't been able to make use of that and make that data open and accessible. So some good news on improvements to open data in many countries, but still we have a long way to go. But open data is tremendously important for the topic today, which is the data sharing. Thank you.
Agnieszka, I'd like to throw to you now. Now, Data Collaboratives for Local Impact, which is a partnership between the MCC and PEPFAR, was set up to empower communities in the use of data to support a range of local initiatives. Now, your impact research has found that the availability of data and restrictions in access and sharing were barriers that the programs face. So what are some of the specific barriers at the local level that this program identified?
Lisa, thank you for this question. And it's also really nice to be here on this important day. I just want to maybe start with a story and an example. Gwakisa is a ward executive in rural Tanzania. And every year he has to make really important decisions about how to allocate the limited resources that he has to his communities for services that they may need. But he does not have the information and the data to know exactly what services are most needed and where they are needed. So I think for the last 30 years as a development practitioner, there has been an awareness that this local context and information is extremely important in contextualizing the support in the development space. And at MCC, MCC is a US government agency in the business of alleviating poverty through sustainable economic growth. We really put a premium on country ownership, which means that it is those countries and the local communities within them that are supposed to have a voice and lead their own development. But what we're seeing is that data has not necessarily been at the forefront of this conversation. And when we think of the availability of data and the technologies amidst this data revolution that we are in, as Shaida mentioned, increasingly more data is available. But one of the main barriers that we're seeing is that the skills that are needed or some of the simple digital technologies to access the data are lagging behind, particularly in those rural areas in the local communities. So one of the things that the Data Collaboratives for Local Impact is doing, and this program is a partnership with another US government agency with whom we share a love of data to power actionable investments. But what we've done through programs like Data Zetu, which means our data in Swahili, and also in partnership with the Tanzania Data Lab, we have gone out to those communities. We've gone out to this ward of Gwakisa, and we've helped conduct listening campaigns. What those listening campaigns showed him, for example, is that in 6 of his 8 communities, the lack of dispensaries came up that particular year as a key priority. And then we brought on humanitarian open street maps to train his community leaders and his staff to collect data points. They collected millions of data points on basic local services, the location of schools, existing water points, and other information. And so he was then able to use this information and actually advocate for more funding to be able to build that dispensary. his successor now, only about a couple years later, is moving on to additional priorities using that same information. He's now focused on classrooms for secondary schools. So all this is to say that a key barrier that we've noticed through the data collaborators for local impact are these skill sets that are needed, especially at the rural level, where we are seeing, I think COVID, back to a point that that Shaida mentioned, COVID has just exacerbated some of the differences between who has access to information and particularly who has the skills to turn data into a powerful mechanism to actually move their own development needs forward. So we're very excited in context of the work that we're doing at MCC and also the data collaborators for local impact, that we've worked with a number of organizations that are in that space to start putting forward principles for how the development actors can better engage with local communities to make sure that they are empowered through the use of data that is actually data about them.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Now, expanding upon what you've mentioned there about training and building capacity as well, just for all of you, in terms of when we're building capacity with data, what should we be thinking about when we're building the skills and knowledge to ensure that people are also thinking about privacy with the data, to ensure that that's really part of the foundation of when we're working with data, that there's always that consideration of privacy as part of it. Agnieszka, maybe you want to start there, but this is a question that I'd really love all of your input on.
Yes, I mean, I think that's very important and really hits home as a question for me, because I think that, again, going back to the root of the problem and insufficient understanding of when privacy protection actually applies or when it doesn't. Very often when I interact with staff in ministries in some of our partner countries in Africa, so Côte d'Ivoire is another location that the data collaboratives for local impact and MCC have investments, a standard answer when you ask for a data set is, oh no, there are privacy concerns with this data. And this happens even when in fact there aren't any of those privacy concerns, or when steps could be easily taken to address them through a process of anonymization, for example. And so maybe just going back to the example that I gave you at this local community level, we worked with those communities, our programs worked with those communities to collect millions of local data points. So it was very important in doing so and imparting them the skills to do that, to make sure that they were able to strike that important balance between providing insightful, useful information, but at the same time protecting the privacy of those about whom the data is collected. So of course, there are things like working with the local leaders to make sure that questions did not infringe upon certain sensitive issues and were worded in a way that's protective of the citizens within those communities. It was also extremely important to train and work with the custodian organizations that would be holding that data so that they would understand the laws, the privacy laws that could govern those that information, and to make sure that only those with the right to access could access it. But given the topic of this session, we also really were keen to make sure that this data would be reused by the communities and by this ward executive and his successor. And so there was a very important training on how to anonymize data through fairly simple methodologies called obfuscation. For those of you that may not know what that is, it's essentially blurring which household the information comes from, so you can no longer specifically determine within a particular radius where that information is coming from. So still providing that extremely granular, hyper-local information, but without risking divulging any privacy laws. So again, I think what's really important is to do that. And what we were very pleased to see through that process is, from work that started in a rural ward in Tanzania, even the National Bureau of Statistics, so to the point of national statistics, that I know Shaida deals a lot with, they noticed the usefulness of this kind of information and how quickly it was obtained. And we're one of the first Bureau of Statistics in Africa to then develop a protocol that legitimizes citizen-generated data while protecting privacy. There are all sorts of other challenges with, with data constraints and policies in Tanzania, but this is one occasion on which they then made a step forward in this space.
Fantastic. And Shaida, you had something to add there?
Yeah, I fully agree with Agnieszka. I just wanted to add a couple of points. One point is that before we actually get to building skills for dealing with data privacy, we really need to make sure that there are guidelines, agreed guidelines and standards and safeguards that we all kind of a common language. We all talking about the same thing, and we all sort of focusing on the same thing. So that would be really important. And we have some areas where, for example, in the official statistics sector, we see that the fundamental principle of official statistics, for example, which has been endorsed by the General Assembly of the UN, is a kind of a guiding principle for how to address some of these issues. Of course, not to say that because of the alternative data sources now are in play, because we have data from mobile devices, we have from social media, from scanning data, and so on. There's the complexity of the privacy issues have really increased a lot. So we do need more international guidelines and standards and discussions around this. And that's why I think this is really important. So the training and the teaching would be both in terms of not what it is now, but what research we need to do and what are the new things that we need to look at for making sure that these safeguards are really stand all the challenges that we are facing right now.
I can agree with data sharing being used in the right way, but I need to emphasize the right way, because while I completely agree with Agnieszka that what we need to do is capacity building and teach people, a number of skills, including IT skills, including other skills. I could spend the next, not 25 minutes, but 25 days, 25 centuries almost, coming up with horror stories about the way that open data can be abused. So my first appeal is, please distinguish very carefully between open data and data sharing. You can carry out data sharing in an ethical manner subject to certain rules. Now let's talk about those rules and then come to a couple of horror stories so that we can push away from the most dangerous kind of stuff. Okay, so when it comes to the rules and open data, I'd invite everybody to have a look at the two reports I produced on big data and open data, one of which actually was concluded mostly in Australia. Though we had a worldwide consultation, it was actually in Sydney that we met for the in-person consultation after the online consultation in July of 2018. So there are a number of rules, and often when you talk about open data, if you're in my shoes, you feel as if you're the only guy to speak up against motherhood and apple pie, or to rain on other people's parties, right? But I have to share with you the truth and not some illusion. I have been working in data protection and privacy now for more than 36 years. 36 years ago, I would have agreed that anonymization is an appropriate safeguard. Today, I cannot do that, right? With big data analytics, even if you anonymize, it's not enough, right? So you have to be very, very careful. And open data, I get a bit scared when I listen to people going on through how well we're doing with open data, because then I say, okay, so what do you want us to do? You have to face the truth and say, what are the rules? The rules should be that only the right data is collected for the right purpose, to be used in the right way, by the right people, stored in the right way. Who are the right people? And what is the right way? Which brings us to data sharing. Putting whole loads of data online, that's not the right way to go, right? There are several data sets which are collected around the world, both in developing countries and in developed countries, which can use them in certain ways, subject to certain safeguards. And there's a whole bunch of safeguards. Obfuscation, which Agnieszka mentioned, is just one of them. But let me talk about a couple of experiences in sub-Saharan Africa, because as Shaida was correctly mentioning too, you also have cases now where we're getting much more data from social media, the APIs, etc. That same data, unfortunately, can be used by some autocratic governments, authoritarian governments in those countries, to identify ethnic minorities and carry out ethnic cleansing, right? So let us be very, very careful as to how we tackle the subject. Please count the number of authoritarian governments you have around the world, both developed and developing countries. See where you want to operate, and then start scratching your head properly. Because unfortunately, the training is not there. And unfortunately, the culture that exists within a number of governments is or can be more directed towards exploitation for all the wrong reasons. So my very strong suggestion is this: start off with a culture of privacy from the age of 4 or 5, right? Because the truth is, what we need very much, I see this in developing countries too, but it's exactly the same in developed countries.
Unfortunately, it is almost at the end of our time together. I really appreciate you all being here, but I want to make sure that you can share particular insights that you want our audience to take away. So Agnieszka, do you want to start with providing an insight for our audience?
Thank you, Lisa. And I mean, I've loved the contrasting perspectives here, because I think it's neither one nor the other, it's both. And I guess the perspective that I want listeners to take away from this is that with the data revolution and these complexities of big data, and yes, the differing incentives, what's really important is to make sure we don't leave behind the local communities. That in order for there to be this inclusive access to the global digital economy, we do need to build capacity there, initially with simple information, but to be able to make sure that at these local communities, they can have access to simple information and also begin that learning about the importance of privacy, but also about what data might be collected by others outside. I would also encourage donors and development organizations to prioritize this issue, to put more funding towards this, because the future is the global digital economy. And I think COVID has kind of shown the impacts of digital connectivity on both managing the process of a pandemic and other crises, but also on the potential for recovery. So I also encourage listeners to be on the lookout for these principles for subnational data use that the data collaboratives for local impact are putting out. Thank you.
Well, my take-home message is you should worry, but not too much, because you shouldn't reinvent the wheel, right? We've been working on the wheel for a long time. When we talk about the wheel, that means that we have, when it comes to priorities in life, right? We have detailed rules about health data, for example. And if you want to, I have, I can refer you to about 40 pages of recommendations and 40 pages of explanatory memorandum that I presented to the General Assembly of the United Nations last year. We have an international framework for data protection law in Convention 108+. We have 2 reports on open data and big data with a whole bunch of do's and don'ts. Some don'ts are really simple, once again, learning from the Australian and other examples. Never put online data at unit level. That crucifies you, right? It's just not clever, right? So there are a number of simple rules for you to move on. There are very important issues on gender. Please look at the recommendations on gender, which I just presented after an online and in-person consultation, which I just presented to the UN Human Rights Council in March 2020, 2 days before COVID really hit us. There are other rules which I'll later be coming up with about and recommendations about children and privacy. So it's not only gender, children and privacy, because in the same way as we need to look after people's privacy, in the same way as we need to train children and teach them and foster education for both youth and adults, we also need to make sure that the principles of developing and allowing children to develop their right to personality is very important. And that is my final note. In other words, each and every one of us has the right to develop our personality freely, unhindered. That's what privacy is for. That's what freedom of expression is for. Those are enabling rights to help everybody, whether it's a developed country or a developing country, to develop properly. And data is only there to serve that purpose. Thank you, Lisa.
Well, I just wanted to say that for me, the ideal would be that for countries and agencies to really treat data as a valuable asset for their operation and treat it as they would treat, for example, building business, building infrastructure, and building a school. I mean, importance of data should be much more realized in planning and in budgeting at agency and at the country level and setting priorities. The second thing I wanted to say is that in that context, data governance and having data, chief data officers, having data stewards is very important. Those are the people that would be worrying about, how the data is governed, and with the ultimate goal of, getting the value of data out and making data sharing, responsible data sharing. For us, open data is really a responsible open data. It's much more of making sure that data is accessible and reaches the audience that it is intended to do, but in a responsible way. So my final message is we should do data sharing, but do responsible data sharing. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us. This has been a magnificent conversation. As I said, I would love to go on for hours more. I think all of you have great insights that we all really enjoy hearing. But thank you for this brief period where we've been able to have a conversation. And thank you for joining us as part of Devex World.